The investigation that the New York Times published in late 2018 into Donald Trump's finances and his family's finances would go on to win a Pulitzer Prize with an exclamation point. That report revealed the extent to which the president's money really had come from the fortune his father left him and not through his own work in business. An inherited fortune that the Times reported was inflated through, quote, dubious tax schemes and, quote, instances of outright fraud that President Trump carried out along with his siblings. That report led, among other things, to the president's older sister, Marianne, stepping down from a lifetime seat as a federal judge so as to avoid an ethics inquiry into her finances. But now, in a blockbuster new book, Mary Trump, the president's niece, says that she was a source for the Times in that report. I should also mention that Mary Trump, incidentally, also quotes a lot of really nasty things that the president's retired judge older sister has to say about him since the time he started running for president and since he has been in the Oval Office. But now we are awaiting a ruling any day now from the United States Supreme Court on whether the president's financial records and taxes have to be turned over to state investigators in New York and congressional investigators. And while we await that, and while we start to appreciate how financial entanglements and fights like that can lead to all sorts of dubious and, well, all sorts of interesting family lore. That New York Times opus remains the best key that we have to understanding how our president got his money and whether his supposed business fortune really may have been the product of a long-running criminal scheme along with members of his family. Joining us now is Suzanne Craig, investigative reporter for the New York Times, and with her colleagues Russ Buettner and David Barstow, winner of the Pulitzer for that investigation of the Trump family finances. Suzanne Craig, thank you so much for making time for us tonight. I'm really glad you could do so.
Thanks for having me.
So I would never ask you about your sources, and I'm not going to tonight, but Mary Trump in this book is volunteering that she was a source of yours and provided you and your colleagues with documents for your reports. I do just have to ask, as she recounts this part of her family saga and what she learned and what she understands about her family and money in her own states and all this, does it comport with your own reporting and what you and your colleagues found at the Times?
I mean, it's interesting because we spent 18 months going through it, and we learned a lot about sort of how the Trumps think about finances. And one of the things that Mary Trump brings up in her book is appraisals. And I think we learned pretty quickly when we started to go through both the confidential documents that we had obtained and public documents, you start to see how they treat appraisals. And when they have something that's charitable, the appraisal goes really high so they can get the tax deduction. And when they have something that they want to lower their tax bill on, the appraisal goes lower. So there's definitely a lot of things that happened that we saw that went to appraisals, and we looked at a number of things that they did over years that had to do largely with low appraisals so that they could avoid taxes.
Part of the fight over the publication of this book, which officially comes out next week, is whether or not Mary Trump is bound by a confidentiality agreement she signed as part of a court settlement over the settlement of the president's father's gigantic estate. She's fighting that by saying, listen, the settlement of that estate was itself fraudulent because assets within her grandfather's estate were systematically undervalued so as to cheat her and her brother out of their fair share. That seems to be in keeping with the kinds of patterns that you described in terms of the way the estate and the way the assets of the Trump organization in general were treated by the president and his siblings.
Well, when I think about this, I think I break it up into two pieces. One is, I think, Fred Trump died and a lot of things went into his will and ended up in probate, and it sort of looked like he was worth $30 million. So when Mary Trump and her brother kind of saw that, they probably thought, well, that's his estate. But in fact, in the previous years, in 96 and 97, Donald Trump and his siblings pretty much took out most of everything that Donald Trump, or that Fred Trump, their father, owned, and they put it into trust. So when Fred and Mary see what's actually gone into probate court after their grandfather dies, it's basically the carcass of really what he owned, which was hundreds of millions of dollars. So the value of what ended up there was maybe 30 million. And then they had a separate suit there where they were saying that that their aunts and uncles took advantage of Fred Trump and diminished what, basically got them disinherited, and they had poisoned his mind, is one point. So there's sort of just the impression that they were left with, and then their fight to get, just were they disinherited or not, and what role did their aunts and uncles play. But then also you have, when they go to settle, their aunts and uncles, they came to an agreement, and Fred and Mary signed over actually what they inherited in 1981. And part of what Mary Trump talks about in the book is the threats that were made, during that process to get them to sign it over. And there was appraisals involved all throughout. And I think that this is going to continue to play out in the courts, going forward. It's already, in front of a court right now as she struggles to get out of the, the so-called NDA that she's in, where she can't talk.
Suzanne, after the opus that you published in the Times, for which you won the Pulitzer, you subsequently reported that New York regulators, New York investigators were looking into the tax schemes that you and your colleagues reported at the Times. We obviously are now awaiting Supreme Court ruling on as to whether or not New York investigators can subpoena the president's financial records. That's there along with a similar question about whether or not congressional investigators can look at the president's tax returns. Is there anything that you can tell us tonight in terms of your understanding, your reporting about those investigations, and whether or not the president and his family is potentially in trouble for any of the stuff that you guys were able to report out?
I mean, we haven't seen a lot of tractions on the city and state investigations that started out. I mean, there's still something may come of it, but we haven't. And I think what we're going to see tomorrow, or potentially tomorrow, it's going to be, one morning in the next few weeks, is whether or not the tax returns will be turned over either to prosecutors in New York and also to congressional investigators. So there's kind of two things going on there. And I don't know how that's going to land, but it's separate from the work that we did, which is, other investigations that could be going on.
Suzanne Craig, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter at the New York Times. Thank you so much for your time tonight, and I'm grateful to Mary Trump for the vivid display of how you do your work and how you persuaded her to provide this material. It's a fascinating window into how you work. Thank you so much, Suzanne.
That was a bit of a movie scene, so thanks for the reading.
I appreciate it. All right, you know what? I'm never going to be in the movies. This is as close as I get. I read stuff on TV and imagine myself there. All right. More ahead here tonight. Stay with us.